It's my pleasure and privilege to be talking to Gerry tonight. This is, I think, the first time he has appeared on the Féile in any capacity, but it's certainly the first occasion in which he has been on talking about his books. So it's my delight and pleasure to interview him. Somebody asked me, was I nervous? And I said, well, as long as Gerry doesn't fix in one spot on the wall and stay silent for the next 60 minutes. The first and obvious question, Gerry, is you've produced 15 books. Where do you get the time? Where did you get the time in a life that's been filled with politics, with struggle, with...
Well, first of all, thanks for doing this.
My pleasure.
For your work, that's Jude. Well, I only started just in preparation for this, and this probably is one of the few times that I have done anything at the Féile. I mean, I work with the Féile and support it, of course, but I try to avoid doing public gigs. And only just over the last few days, as I began to prepare for this, the answer to your question, well, the first book was published 36 years ago. So that's a good while. The other thing, a lot of them are slightly adapted publications of blogs or essays or articles. So, I'd be doing one of those every week.
Yeah.
So, if you publish that every 3 or 4 years, you end up with 200 or 300
Yeah,
pieces.
but if you take Hope and your two big books, Before the Dawn and Hope and History, they're very substantial books, crammed with detail about from your very childhood up to the beginning of negotiations towards a peace and right up to the Good Friday Agreement. Those in themselves are huge. They're not adapted, are they, from any, or were you taking notes then, or was somebody giving a record you have to do research afterwards?
Well, at some point in my, I mean, let me go back a wee bit just to tell you how I started this. I was in Longcash, and Donny Morrison, who was the editor of Republican News, asked me would I contribute an article looking at and observing and commenting on what was happening outside. So I started to do that, but quite quickly they became observations really about what was happening inside, and I enjoyed doing that. My first published work was False Memories, and that was again I was out of prison. I was walking down the falls, and there were big Brit patrols about, and I went into the district to get away from the patrols, and I realised just how much the neighbourhood had changed. So I wrote a sort of a reminiscent piece about that, the place I grew up in. And two publishers, John Féine from Mercier and Steve MacDonagh from Brandon Books, both contacted me and asked me could I make a book out of it. So it was put together, this was in the wake of the hunger strike, it was put together in a very haphazard way, written on the back of the car, written because I wasn't staying at home, written in houses that I was staying in. And I also went into the National Library in Dublin occasionally, which I found was a brilliant experience.
Yeah.
And I did the research. Now, if you fast forward decades later, the research on what I'm currently writing and the detail and the checking of facts and the drafting of bits and pieces is done by Richard McCauley, who's here somewhere.
Yeah.
Where is Richard? Oh, Richard. Yes. So for I don't know how many years, he would be checking all of this. These certainly the first one. Richard was involved in the second one, which is Hope and History. I don't think he was so much involved. He says no.
No.
Right. He's denying any involvement. Now, one of the things, just interestingly, when we started to become involved in more formal engagements with the British, this is an interesting little sort of, for me anyway, and for anybody that's interested. We couldn't find any record of any negotiations that Republicans had been involved in previously. Of course, there were public records and there were the views of those who were involved, but there wasn't any detail, like a minute of a meeting or a note of a meeting. So God rest Siobhan O'Hanlon, one of the jobs that she had was to keep a record of everything. And also to bring into the centre any report that anybody had about a meeting which they had been involved in. And that famously, the record of exchanges where Mayhew, who was the British Secretary of State, put out a totally false account, denied there was any involvement in talks with us, and because we had a record, which was all over the place, but we were able to pull it together. So I drew on that material for this, and I very consciously made it detailed. I very consciously thought that we needed to tell that story, that was our story, and we needed to tell it, and somebody else might have their narrative or their account, but we were getting ours on the record.
Because that was the next question I was going to ask you. Why do you write? I mean, you've explained why you wrote in this case, because you wanted to pull together, as you say, the story of that time, and from your point of view and from the Republican point of view. Is that what motivates you to write? Like George Orwell said that when he sat down to write, he wasn't trying to create a work of art. He said what he did was try to expose some lie, get something straight, achieve something from it, rather than any literary endeavour.
Well, I've told you the reason why I ended up being published, which isn't the reason why I wrote in the first instance.
Why did you write in the first instance?
Well, I find it a very therapeutic process. I don't like writing the political stuff. I don't like the polemic. I don't like, that's work. So I don't like that, although that's part of what I do. I do like The Street, for example, as a book of short stories, and I like the notion of being able to encapsulate something. I'm fascinated by this notion. I was opening an exhibition here the other day, and I was paying tribute to Bobby Bala, and I was making the case that I think it's brilliant to be able to live out of your imagination. So I'm in awe of people who can make music, who can do the visual arts, who can move us, take us out of ourselves, lift us, motivate us, empower us, make us cry. I just think that's and to be able to do that as a work of imagination. So I haven't had the chance to do that. I'm doing a wee bit now. I've just sort of nearly finished the short story at the moment, and I've enjoyed it thoroughly because it's you need if you're going to write fiction, you need time for daydreaming.
Yeah, but you see, even in the factual works, even in Hope and History, and in Before the Dawn, you're going back to your childhood even, at the very beginning of it. And in fact, you have a very funny description of something that many Irish writers have dealt with, and that is your first confession. Would you like to read a bit of that, would you? His last, is it? It's down at the bottom of the right-hand side there.
Come on, shit. Okay, do you want me to read on?
Yeah, we'll read a bit of it anyway. No, just maybe over the next page.
Okay. So the whole class went down to St. Peter's. We marched down in twos, filed into the pews with their cold, shiny seats. As one by one we genuflected in the side aisle, we moved to sit on the bench, either side of the confession box. And as the line dwindled, we were carried forward into the confession box. The boy coming out smirked at me as he held the door open. I knelt down in the semi-gloom as the door slammed behind me. Above me there was a small ledge, and from beyond the ledge I could hear the mumble of a man's voice. A minute later I heard the slam of something being drawn closed, and then above my head an aperture opened and a friendly adult voice boomed manfully down on me. "Good morning, my son. Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. This is my first confession." I hesitated. "Go on, my son," the voice encouraged me. "I give back cheek to my mother 5 times, Father. I give cheek to my granny twice, Father. I wanted to kill my sister Margaret 4 times, Father." "You wanted to kill your sister Margaret?" the voice asked. "Yes, Father." "And when was that?" "Well, once last year, Father, in the summer, and then on Christmas Day when she opened up my stocking, and then on Easter when she broke my egg, and then yesterday, Father." "And does your sister Margaret annoy you?" "Yes, Father." "Well, you know you're going to have to be more patient." "Yes, Father, and oh, I said a bad word, Father, 15 times." "What did you say?" "I said frig. And I robbed an orchard once, and me and my friends tied thread to Old Ma Doran's door, and we played kick the door all night. Oh, and I hit Terence McManus. He was hitting our paddy, Father. Our paddy always gets me into trouble. He said that Terence McManus kicked him, and my dad sent me out to hit Terence, and Terence is bigger than me, but I bled his nose, but I didn't mean to, Father. And I beat Billy Dunn on a fair dig. And what happened then? Well, Billy hit me with a brick in the back of the head. I got him later with a hurdy stick. Is that all? Our paddy's kitten got its head stuck in a tin of stewing steak and it died. And I cursed at our paddy that day. And I got my teeth broken over him for nothing. Is there more? Yes, I cheated at Marty's 67 times. And how did you do that? Well, everybody does it, Father. I move my mom when I'm taking a shot. 67 times? Well, at least 67 times. Could it be more? It could, Father. And so on, and so on.
It's a crowded field, but because Frank O'Connor has written on that, and Brian Féile have both written very good stories. But that's what point I want to emphasise. You managed to insert these personal details or even accounts into what in fact is sort of a documentary account of the time. You described, for example, at one point with your mother, and you're talking to her and you're filling in a form. You must have been about 16 at the time. And it's asking you what your nationality is. Do you remember that? And it says you say British or Irish, and you're asking her, you know, what should you put? And she's non-committal. She tells you to make up your own mind on that. Was that something that you genuinely had any doubt about at that stage of your life, at 16?
Well, first of all, that first confession, it was directly related to Frank O'Connor's first confession. That's what put it into my into my head. And secondly, a man called Sean Dinan was a teacher down in St. Mary's, and he took us for a free period one day, and he introduced me to the history of the place in which I lived. So he told us we were in Barrack Street, where Barrack Street got his name, where Divis Street got his name, about Bohana Wall, about Sleeve Divish, and so on, and Sleeve Do. And that introduced me into the whole field of the oral tradition and the small stories, because what we had been learning in school, it was all about the big people. It was all about the generals and the prime ministers and the statespersons, so-called, and it was all about empire. So he introduced me to the world of the little people of the the importance, and therefore I try to introduce those things because you can tell a story easier in that way and humanize it. And anyway, it mightn't even be as thoughtful as that. It's just you start writing. You must know this. You start writing, and you don't know what's going to come out of it. I was saying I was working on a short story last week, and I was quite surprised at what my pen was writing.
Yeah.
Because I hadn't thought it out. So what was the question?
The question was you were discussing with your mother whether you should be British or Irish. I'm interested in that because when I used to work in what's called now Ulster University, there used to be students applying from secondary school, and there used to be application forms, and some of these would come from big schools in West Belfast like St. Louise's, and I would look at these and I'd say nationality and I'd say British. And I was wondering, where are all these unionists that are going to St. Louise's? But of course, what they were doing was playing safe. They weren't going to. They were going to try to make sure that if some bigot got this, that they weren't going to have that avenue to block them at least.
Well, mine was a more general asking my mother for support with the form. It was the first form that I had filled in, almost like a rite of passage. I was in St. Mary's at this point. And what surprised me was that the form would ask such a question. Because whatever, I probably was just at the beginning of my political consciousness at that time. But I'd always been conscious of my nationality. We always played hurling, we played football. We knew we were Irish. I was very lucky to have relations in Dublin, so from since the first time down, won in All Ireland, now we're down probably 1961. I've been up and down to Dublin, so I was very conscious of that and very settled in that. And incidentally, there is a census coming up again. And I think if anybody can influence anybody else filling that in, don't put in Northern Irish. Just put in Irish, and try and influence people. Some people are on a little journey, and we should assist that little journey in the time ahead.
Okay. You also in this give a very vivid account of your own experience of being interrogated and the beatings that you got. And it's very detailed, very factual, dispassionate almost. And when I read it, I wondered, how can you do that? I think if somebody had done that to me, I would forever remember it and I would hate them. But you seem certain detachment is almost as if you're describing somebody else getting...
Well, let me answer this first of all. I was in Louth today. I'm a TD, very honoured to be a TD in Louth. So I thought of all the things that you might ask me, so I wrote down all the things that I read when I was a child. Enid Blyton, Just William, Famous Five, Secrets 7, Biggles, The Beano, The Topper, The Dandy, Roy of the Rovers, Black Beauty, Robinson Crusoe.
Who nudged you towards those, or was that a natural thing that everybody was doing?
That's what everybody. There wasn't any for a kid. There wasn't any sort of Irish genre. There's more now of Irish.
But you must be a reader.
Stories.
Must be a reader. You couldn't write the way you do if you weren't a reader.
No, but my granny Adams introduced me to the Falls Library when I was. I may have been 6 or 7 at the time. I was trying to figure this out today, or I may have been younger. But she introduced me to reading. She was what was called a half-timer. She, as a child, had worked in the mills. They worked in the mill one day or one morning, and they went to school for the other half. So she was a working class woman, widowed, young, and reared a large family. But she loved reading, and reading was escapism for her, and she introduced that to me, and it stuck with me. So the beatings. Well, first of all, it's over.
Yeah.
That's first of all. And I was up at, I've told this story quite a few times, but I was up on Stormont one day, and I was in the lift, and I was going up in the lift, and there was this quite small man. He was one of the ushers or security people, and we were on our own, and he was English, and he said to me, do you remember you were arrested and you were taken to Springfield Road Barracks and you were beaten very badly? And I said, I do. And he said, well, I was one of the people who did it, and I'm sorry. And I said to him, now, because I was much taller than him, we were on our own, and I had him surrounded. I said to him, do you promise not to do it again? And we shook hands. So, you know, a number of times, and this is not an unusual, I hate to think that anybody would think this was unusual. Unfortunately, it wasn't unusual. So, you know, anybody who was in Long Cash or Belfast Prison or the Maidstone, I was in the prison ship Maidstone for a while, I was beaten in all three places, which are very painful places to be beaten. But the interrogation, before all of the revelations about inhuman and degrading treatment, and before they adopted the more psychological means of trying to get people to admit things they didn't do, it was just a case of being put up against a wall, spread-eagled, and being beaten. And for whatever period you were in, for 3 days or 4 days or 7 days, a gang of us, God rest Brendan Hughes, myself, one or two others, we went into Long Cash after that event in Springfield Road Barracks, and we couldn't walk for days. For days we couldn't actually physically walk. The same thing happened in Palace Barracks. I escaped the early internment carry on, but subsequently, and that's probably what you're talking about there, and again it was the same. A few times when we tried to escape, and were caught. One particular time we were fairly badly beaten. I'll tell you this quick story. Excuse my language when I'm telling you it. I was in the punishment block, and we were all naked. We were all in different cells, and I was lying there, and I was feeling sorry for myself. And they had a Brit in the corridor. The punishment block maybe only has 6 cells in it. It isn't a big, it's a single-story building. And they had a Brit in the corridor, and he had a war dog. And there were about 30 Brits around the punishment block. And it was Christmas. It was Christmas Eve. And I was lying there, and Tommy Toland is in the cell next door. And I hear him shouting, "Hi, Brit! Brit! My name's Gerry Adams, and I'm going to knock your bollocks in." So, anyway.
Slightly warm sense of humor. You wrote Cage 11, which, to my shame, I've only read very recently. But you describe how, when you were in Cage 11, you began writing the Brownie column that you're referring to now. And you said you're one of a number of people. Were there others? I always thought that you were the Brownie columnist.
Well, Richard Macaulay has confessed. Richard Macaulay actually used to be in charge of all the Republican propaganda coming out of Long Cash. And he censored me numerous times for stuff that I wrote. So, Brownie was a collective. I probably was the best of them, but it was a collective.
Yeah. How did you get them out? And what were the Brits doing? You were able to do it so regularly, and this then would appear in Phobail.
Well, they were smuggled out, but it was when material was smuggled out of the Hates blocks and Armagh Women's Prison, for that matter, they were on skins on cigarette paper. But it was possible. I mean, the people in the cages had typewriters and so on. So it was possible to get very fine paper, and then just roll the thing up really tight and smuggle it out. And they're bound to have known stuff.
Well, I was going to say the authorities must have known.
Yeah, but
that was happening regularly.
most prisoners didn't use the censor. Most prisoners writing to their wives or their lovers, or their wives and their lovers, would have just sent the stuff out regularly with their friends, and because it's nobody likes them. I actually found some letters there recently which went through the censor, and it's just interesting little items of personal memorabilia. But no, that wasn't such a big deal. The people in the blocks had a much harder time than anybody ever had. Now, obviously, individual.
This personal stuff, letters to their families.
Of course, yeah.
But you were sending out stuff from Phobail.
Yeah. Well, it was Republican news at the time, but yes, as I say, that wouldn't have been. It wouldn't have been unusual to have, however you would describe that unorthodox sort of smuggling route.
There's I was very struck by the fact that so many of the pieces that you wrote then, and I think you say something about this actually in the foreword to Cage 11, that you get the impression that people are in very good spirits in almost all of the Brownie columns. Occasionally you have a very pretty bleak one, but most of them are pretty funny actually. You talk about the pigeons that are landing and you're trying to tame. You talk about a guy distilling poaching and a guy getting absolutely blind drunk and finding his way to the wire and shouting at the guard who's there with the dog. You talk about an Ardèche that's held within the cage. So there's sometimes a mixture, and I find this interesting in your writing. You sometimes start at a light note and then it moves into something rather darker. And there's one, the first piece I would like you to, maybe if you wouldn't mind reading. It's called, I think, a piece, Remembering a Hedgehog. And Gerry tells this story of a hedgehog he found when he was a teenager, and brought it home, and it wasn't welcome. There was talk about fleas being on hedgehogs and get that dirty thing out of here and so on. So in the wee small hours, himself and a girl called Dorothy, who was a teenager at the time, I think, she agreed to go with him. And the thing was to avoid British Army patrols. So they managed to avoid them and drop the hedgehog back in his natural habitat. And the girl, Dorothy, who's with him, says, sure, you said you weren't sure you should have done that. That was sort of silly and dangerous thing for an old hedgehog. And she says to you, actually, you wouldn't want the poor thing to be killed, would you? And then it goes on from there.
Well, this is the end of that piece that Jude has described. A few short months later, Dorothy herself was dead. She and Murragh, her older sister, heard of a Brit patrol in the Falls while they were at a party. They rushed off in a friend's car to warn the people there. A Brit patrol opened fire on the car and killed the two sisters. It was early in the morning, a morning just like the one we spent bringing the hedgehog to safety. That's the true story. That was Dorothy McGuire, a very close friend of my wife Colette's, and her sister Murragh Meehan, and they were both killed just down the road from here. But Dorothy and I did bring the hedgehog through with the White Rock and West Rock.
I think the way that you talk about it in a light way, and then suddenly you have this cut to the terrible end that the poor woman had. Very effective, and you use that quite a bit actually. There's another one in those pieces from Brownie, which is about moles. It's called Moles, and you're talking about the number of tunnels that have been dug, and there's so many of them that the ground is collapsing almost. And then you tell of a guy who gets through on a tunnel and gets out, and he's shot dead. As soon as there's a soldier waiting for him, and he shoots him dead. And you guys hear that, and you try to create some distraction. But again, it's that light-hearted thing about the number of tunnels and the lack of success and so on. And then suddenly, it just hits you like a slap on the face. Something grim at the end of it. And there's another one, but a slightly lighter note, which is a very serious piece. It's called Christians for Freedom by Browning. And it's about the role of the church, the Catholic Church, during the Troubles, and to what extent they took sides. But Gerry talks about his meeting with how he met Bishop Philbin one time, or nearly met him, and he goes on to say that he nearly met him a second time, and then he nearly met Cardinal Conway one time. So this is when he was in Cage 11, so he was a bit preoccupied at the time, so they didn't actually meet. So do you want to read this down, Gerry?
Well, this is, I'm a bit embarrassed to read this.
That's okay, that's why I asked you to do it.
Thank you, Jude. I was seated on the toilet one day, bowed down with matters of theological interest, when the Cardinal was shepherded past me by a crusade of curates. We never got within smelling distance of each other, and having a more important matter on hand, so to speak, he and I passed our respective ways, unchallenged. One of the things that and I'm going through a little sort of process at the moment, a little personal process. But one of the things that from I was a kid, from I was at St Mary's, and I note that in one of these books. I remember taking issue with the church's teachings, and I remember as a student challenging the brother. This is the sort of the arrogance of youth on give to Caesar the things that are Caesar and give to God the things that are God. And then later, and very influenced by Father Desmond Wilson, who was a curate up in my parish up in Ballymurphy. But we organised a picket of the bishop's house, because here we all were in Ballymurphy and getting on with our lives. And that one morning we woke up and we were surrounded by British soldiers, and that they had taken over local GAC grounds, and they'd taken over the local church hall, and so on and so on and so on. And then the bishop lands in to tell us that we should be nice to them, and to give off, and to talk about the riots in Ballymurphy has been caused by violent people. So I remember going to Tess Cahill and saying to Tess, could we picket the bishop's house? And we could have taken 200 women, because people were so incensed by that. So later on, before that, when the barricades were up down at St Peter's, they were all in pre-Belfast, the bishop arrived out to instruct people to take the barricades down. So there was this sort of line of tension between myself individually, although I was always respectful towards priests, and when I was in jail, I was always respectful towards priests, and would have organised a cup of tea for them and so on. And I remember reading a book, I think it was by a man called Richard Parr, but it's a book called The Hungry Grass, which I would recommend to anyone, because it tells of the loneliness of being a priest. And it's quite a compelling story. Anyway, so there was always this tension, and it's a historical tension between progressive thinking in Ireland, radical thinking in Ireland, Republican thinking in Ireland, and the establishment, the church, the hierarchy. But this was me taking issue with some of what I thought, and still think very, very much, was their totally wrong steer. Where I came from, 2 priests were killed by the British Army. If that was El Salvador or some, it would be cause célèbre. If at any time the Catholic hierarchy had made it clear that it was for rights, that it was for equality, there wouldn't have been a conflict. There certainly wouldn't have been a physical force conflict. So that's what that little bit of was about. My regret about Cage 11 is I published it, as I said earlier, as just separate pieces that were written. It has a novel in it, and I regret that I published it the way I published it, and that I should have written it as a
well.
novel.
There's a lot in it, even as it stands. In fact, I was going to ask you finally, just from Cage 11, if you would read there's a description of Christmas, and it's. I sometimes think it's very interesting to see somebody who's so committed to politics, who moves sort of sideways and is talking about something in non-political terms. I think that's a very lyrical piece with which I think you close Cage 11.
Well, this was, remember this book was written 36 years ago, and I haven't read it in decades, so I've only got a vague recollection of this, but notionally, this was a guy making a child's cot as a Christmas present, and going through the whole process of making it and so on and so forth. So it was a strange scene with dusk setting in and the sun going down, giving a grey coldness to the cage lights. The seagulls, with their hysterical keening, were kiting in from the burn house to gobble up a late snack, and the child's cot, white and silent, stood alone on the black tarmac. Screw watchtowers, straddling the gaps between the cages, looked down their noses at us, and then, as the last of its colours drained from the sun, after a magic moment of complete silence, we heard the heavy beating of wings, and the swans passed overhead in single file, chasing the sun as it retreated before them.
I think that's really absolutely lovely. And you do the same thing, same kind of thing at the beginning of Hope and History, which is the other big factual book that you've written, where you wanted to pull together the record of the time. And you started in the introduction, you say, sometimes I go to the edge of the world, to the northwest of Ireland, where on dark, clear nights the skyscape stretches forever. I'm there now, trying to figure out how to tell the story of the Irish peace process. Here, on the edge of Europe, a huge expanse of ocean stretches out in front of me to New York and the Americas. Ireland, inland at my back, across rugged mountain ranges, lies the road to Belfast. Beyond, separated from Ireland by a narrow sound of water, is Britain. It's that kind of writing. Did you place these at the time you were writing the book, or would you have put that in after you'd written the factual account?
No, I started off with that, and I was trying, I suppose, to rise above it. I was trying to, we are a small island. We're only 6 million people. So I was trying to sort of, every so often I would tell some of our grandchildren who might be going to Donegal and I'd be going to Dublin, I would say, imagine the map of Ireland and your wee car's going up there and our wee car's going down there. So I was trying to sort of rise above it and look in on it. And it's also what I was saying. I was saying earlier. To write with any, and I think my efforts are quite modest, but to write with any possibility of success, you need time. You need time to daydream. You need time to play with the concept, with the word. You could simply Steve MacDonagh, the man who published my first book, was quite influential with me, where he said, don't overwrite. And some of my things I underwrite. Right? The stuff I'm writing at the moment, the person who's the publisher, O'Brien's, is saying, you need to fill it out a bit. You need to fill the character out. So it's only when you actually have a bit of space, when you have a bit of time, when you have no distractions, that you can consider. And I thought a good way to enter that book was the way that you have just described. And incidentally, this is the nicest interview I've ever done.
Is this compared to the one that's in the book? Well, thank you. You talk about in the Hope and History one, which is leading up to the Good Friday Agreement, you talk at one point about how events were coming so rapidly one after the other. And the example you take is the week when 3 IRA volunteers were executed in Gibraltar. Their bodies are brought home. Michael Stone attacks the funeral, kills 3 people. Then there's the funeral, and the 2 corporals are killed. And it's just one thing after another until people are almost groggy. And you mentioned the fact that in that same week, Jim Gibney was released from prison. And you're saying, now for us, it was almost hard to come to terms with the way things were happening. They're happening so hard and so fast. But that for somebody like Jim, who'd been in prison, in the relative tranquility of prison, to cope with that must have been very difficult. Was that a common experience for you, presumably for Jim, that you were being hit by things so quickly that it was hard to make sense of them sometimes?
Well, the reason I mentioned Jim, is Jim here?
He is.
He was earlier on. A very good friend of Jim, John Leonard, who's a very good friend of ours, has just died. So I just want to dedicate this little event tonight to John and to his family, and commiserations to Jim. The reason I put Jim in there, because he was just out, was when the, and some people here, I see some of the older people here were there on the day, but when the car, which had the 2 British undercover soldiers in it, came up, it came up abreast of the funeral. So we were at the head of the funeral, so it passed us at the shops, and then it reversed back again, and then it ended up getting hemmed in and so on. But in the middle of all the sort of melee and so on, I saw Jim. I could just see him standing there in the middle of it all, almost as if, he was in shock, or he was. Now, obviously, he coped with this the way the rest of us did, but it just struck me that in the week or so, and it wasn't just the events at Gibraltar, although they were huge in all of our lives, particularly the families of the volunteers who were killed, but also all the effort to get the remains home. And then the funerals coming up from Dublin, and through the night. I rarely passed that stretch of a road. There's a stretch of road, I think it's Lady Dixon Park, it's on the right-hand side of the M1, coming to Belfast. So a very close friend of mine, Terry Clark, Clicky Clark, they didn't have mobile phones at that time, but he had this big thing, it was like the size of a breeze block, for keeping contact with us on the way up. And the whole way from the border, the RUC were trying to separate the hearses from us, and we were hemmed in and wouldn't let them in. And I won't take too long telling the story, but it was a unique journey in the towns and villages that we came through. Like thousands of people in Newry. Like it took us a long time just to get through Newry. And then as we came off the road at little crossroads, you could see people on the side of the road saying the rosary, or one or two places maybe some loyalist people throwing stones. But as we come up the sweep of the motorway, and Eamon McCauley was driving the car that I was in, Cleaky said to me, "Where are you?" And I said, we'll be there soon. He was on Kennedy Way with a large group of people from the city. And as we turned that bend, there must have been 100 Jeeps and Land Rovers just in on us. And they drove really tight, right, boxed us in, really, really tight. And then after sitting in complete silence, except for the noise of the engines running and the shouts and the yelling and so on and so forth, they tried to inch in between our cars and the hearses, and we had spread the hearses. So there were 3 hearses, so with a relatively small cavalcade. Martin McGuinness, God rest him, was there also. And then they started to move, and of course we had to move with them. And then they started to move faster and faster. And then when we got to Kennedy Way, they just edged us out of it. The Land Rover just edged us out of it. So that, you know, the road that you come off the motorway, Eamon had no choice, because he would have ended up being killed. But they edged the car out, right? And we went on down into Kennedy Way, and I addressed the crowd and told them that the RUC had hijacked the hearses. But what did they do? They took them straight home. It was ridiculous. It was just to show that they were in charge. That's what it was. The whole thing was just, once they got us out of it, the hearses just were brought to the wake houses. So it was just the British state saying, we're in charge. You're not taking these people home. So I rarely pass that stretch of the road without thinking of Cleaky, because I said to him, "We're okay, I'll see you in a minute." And of course, the exact opposite thing.
Yeah, you describe that very vividly in the book, actually. The question I asked you was, in the heat of the events, were you always, in your own mind, had you some overarching sense of the direction in which things were going? Or is that only something you're able to get in retrospect afterwards? Because you give us lots of detail in these books. And I'm just wondering, as you were experiencing them, had you a sense of what direction this was all going?
Well, if you're talking about incidents, I find, so far anyway, that I'm relatively calm during something. It might be afterwards that I would say to myself, you know, that was a mess, or I would get concerned or scared about what had just occurred. If you're talking about the development of our politics and of our struggle, I've always had a view from probably the very early 1970s that there really can be no progress without struggle. And initially, I was very naive when I first became aware of the wrongs that were visited upon people in this statelet. I naively thought it was only a matter of highlighting them, and it would be sorted. And similarly, in the course of armed struggle and all of the rest of it, when I was, as with others in our leadership, were saying the politics of condemnation, forget about it. The politics of denunciation, forget about it. If you really want to make a change, then come up with an alternative. If you think these people are wrong, then come up with a peaceful, unarmed way of making progress. And be consistent. Don't talk about Republican freedom fighters as men and women of violence when you don't do the same thing about the RUC or the UDR or the British Army. But notwithstanding that, I then come around to a position that they were never going to come up with some other way of doing it, that we had to do that ourselves. And it would be wrong to give the impression that we had a grand plan or that we knew how things were going to develop, because we didn't. But we did have a certain very, very key elements in how we proceeded in terms of developing strategy and strategic objectives. And I think they have proven more or less to be the right way to have moved forward.
I want to get fairly quickly to your fiction, but just one last point with regard to this catalogue and these two books. Much of it is a description of visits to the States, and actually I think you're quite modest when you describe your first visit there. You said it was sort of confusion and so on. The description other people have given it was like a rock star arriving, that the entire place almost shut down. But you talk about, on a number of occasions, about the police there, and you said that there was a Patrick's Day parade that you were at, and one of the cops peeled away from the parade, ran over to his girlfriend, went down on one knee and proposed to her, and in tears she accepted it. And Richard Macaulay said, maybe could we get her to make a petition to John Major, who was being difficult at the time, and maybe we get a yes out of him as well. How did you find American police as opposed to the RUC? Or is that too easy a question?
Well, the first time that we went, we were escorted from the airport by a whole sort of cavalcade of police cars, and they're very interesting because they're very exuberant, and they have sirens going and lights going, and they have loudspeakers, so that they tell other motorists, move to one side, move, and that's the way we proceeded in. And when we arrived in that, the first time that Richard was with me, and with all these sirens blaring, when he got out of the car, he put his hands up.
Reflex action.
So, Brendan Behan said once that there is not any situation which doesn't become worse with the arrival of a police officer. So there's He also said when he was being deported from Canada, and he was asked by a journalist what happened. He was only there for 2 days. He says, I come in, I just arrived, and I saw a big sign, drink Canada Dry. But anyway, the interesting thing about I mean, I like the States. I used to have a caricature of the States. I used to have to be honest, I wouldn't mind if I was never in another airplane for the rest of my life. But because, generally speaking, you do these trips, and it's plane, hotel, conference hall, plane, hotel, conference hall. One of the things that I've always done is to get it even an hour or 2 hours just to go off, put on a cap and go off walking just to get, to get to know the place. And I would collect things, if you were in a building and there was a little, advertisement or even a wee history of the building, I would collect those things just, I suppose, because it makes it interesting. But the thing about the police, and obviously, I don't want to be commenting too much on what's happening in the States. We have enough to be doing here. But it's the Irish, you see. That's the connectedness. It's the Irish in the States. And it's their ability, one of those trips, I think we did about 10 or 12 cities.
That's right, 12 you said.
A day. A city a day for 12 days would kill you, just constant travelling and so on.
You had to make a speech at each one. Was it the same speech? And did Richard Macaulay read it?
No, well, Richard wasn't there for that trip, were you? What?
Sadly, yes.
Well, he wrote most of the stuff. Two things. People thought I was being very witty, and I wasn't. I couldn't say, and I still can't say, oh hi ho. So I was quite. They thought I was slagging when I was in ho hi ho, and I was saying, I'm very glad to be here in ho hi ho. So, and then the other place I got mixed up on was Arkansas, as opposed to Arkansas. So I was saying it's good to be here in Arkansas. But it's the Irish. I remember one thing we went to. A woman drove 8 hours. An old woman drove 8 hours to be at the event. And it's the same now. And this notion that the Irish Americans are ill-educated and romanticise and so on and so forth, they will know what's happening in Ireland, those who are interested, quicker than we will. But in this modern age of social media, that they will know, that those who are clued in, those who are fighting, and they stood against the Irish governments, which were very, very bad. You know, remember the Irish government of the day campaigned against the Birmingham Six, campaigned against the McBride principles, and so on. And good, decent Irish Americans made a stand. And you know, Bill Clinton gets a lot of credit, quite rightly, for his role. But what put it on his agenda was, again, Irish America. So I find the place quite fascinating. Have you been reading the Anti-Town News about a guy called Duggan? He was an IRA volunteer during the Town War, and he ended up, he took the anti-treaty side, he ended up in the States, and he died in poverty. And one of his relations discovered this history and got in touch with Joe Austin and Ted Hoyle and a couple of other people. And they traced, and folks in the States found the grave. And they're now going to rededicate the grave before the end of the year. And some places you go to in the States, and you'd go to, I remember going to a little graveyard one time, and there were about 20 graves, all from South Armagh. Just all from Drummondtee and that sort of, and you see that all over the place. And you know, I've travelled also to Australia and South Africa and so on. Albie Sachs was here speaking at the P.J. McGrory lecture the other day, and I ended up with him for an hour or so that evening. And he was talking about Robben Island. And we were in Robben Island. Albie was at Robben Island, and Mandela was in Robben Island, and all the leaders of the ANC were in Robben Island. So we were getting the tour in Robben Island. I actually had great crack with the guide. He was a former prisoner, and he was saying, we used to put our bedrolls here, and I was saying, did you have bedrolls? But anyway, I went to walk. I walked out because I wanted to see the mainland, and because I'd read somewhere that Mandela and them had been forbidden to go to that part because they weren't allowed to see the mainland. So I wanted to see the mainland, and then I cut back and was cutting around the other side, and I saw a sign, and it said Irish Town. So I went back to the guy, and I said to him, there's a sign there for Irish Town. He says, there's a graveyard down there. And we went down, he brought us down. They, as prisoners, had been taken out to cut down the foliage and the overgrowth and all of this crack. And there they were, the Murphys and the Kellys. And so I did a wee bit of research. When the convict ships were leaving Ireland for Australia, and your and my ancestors were being deported to Australia, the ships used to pull in there to load up with provisions and water. And some of the Irish escaped. And they set up this little hamlet. So here you have it. Here, we're travelling. We actually went there to unveil a memorial to the hunger strikers. It was a one-off thing which was allowed because that's a World Heritage Site, but they allowed it to happen the once, so we went to do that. And it's just amazing, as with the States, that you'll find the Irish are everywhere, and that they retain, whether it's in Australia, in South Africa, in North America or Canada, they retain this huge affection for him.
I think you say that they played a major role in the peace process because you had that sense of the whole issue being internationalised rather than the internal British problem as it would be presented by the British. We're really over time already, but I'd like to move very quickly to your actual fiction, The Street. As you say, that's a book of short stories. It's set in Belfast, very real setting, names of streets, names of shops, places and so on. Are the people real? Or are they based on, are they modelled on real people? The characters?
No. Well, they're real insofar as the imagination is real. But give me the name of...
Well, there's, what was it? How Paddy McGlade found the state of grace. There's no such person as Paddy McGlade, and what happened to Paddy McGlade, to my knowledge, never happened to anybody. So Paddy McGlade is a character who's living with his mother. I think he's a drunk, and he lives with his mother, who goes on a novena to Clonard, so that Paddy will give up the drink, and Paddy, owing to a number of circumstances, gives up the drink. So she starts another novena, so he'll get a nice girl. But anyway, sorry, Gerry.
So no, they're obviously. There's a little story in there. I forget the name of it, and it arose from what my uncle Alfie told me. My uncle Alfie told me that there was a man begging in the street, and he was a bit sort of annoyed at him, right? And he was sort of pestering Alfie. And when eventually Alfie went over to him, your man handed him a cigarette. So and Alfie was really contrite and annoyed that it had been judgmental. So that was the trigger for a story.
I was going to say, is that how you get stories? You go for some small incident and then broaden that out. You don't set it with a theme of some kind, like church-state conflict or.
No. I mean, it's just been that long since I've read that book. It's actually my favourite of the books that I've written. And of course, there are parts of people in it that, and there are incidents. I mean, everybody knows a Paddy McGlade.
Yeah.
I'm Paddy McGlade. We're all Paddy McGlades, and we all have mothers who we're not worthy of. Who
could be better.
So, and then I was very influenced by a book that John Steinbeck wrote, Connery Row.
I know it.
So, and it's about it's like a sort of it's like a version of The Last of the Summer Wine. It's about men and it's full of nonsense and so on. But it's very poignant and a brilliant human story. So, I meet people in Connery Row on the Falls Road every day, and I would love to be able to develop a story. Around him. I was telling somebody last week, and I've told this a million times, and it might have been Jimmy Drain, I'm not sure, but anyway, he was refusing to give his name to the British Army. This is an old story. Jimmy Barr. That's Tom Hartley. Jimmy Barr. Jimmy Barr and I were the last two people to be taken off the Maidstone prison ship. And Jimmy, for his sins, was handcuffed to me, which he's never forgiven me for. But anyway, Jimmy was refusing to give his name to the British Army Patrol. And the squaddies were a bit amateurish and Jimmy, of course, was a seasoned street activist. And they sent for a senior officer, and the senior officer came along, and he God bless you, he very diplomatically said to Jimmy, "Why won't you give this soldier your name?" And Jimmy said, "Well, if I give him my name, he'll have two names, and I'll have none." So,
yeah, I think that kind of little quirky humour comes up all the time. For example, in a safe bet, you're talking about, you have quite a long introduction to it, to a particular character is involved with a safe bet, but it's about how to bet and drink when you have no money on a Saturday. And you argue the case that this is something that's definitely common to Belfast. It's common probably to all the towns in Ireland and maybe throughout the world for all we know. And then having sort of opened it as more or less an essay, you go on then and show some characters in action. And it works very well. It seems an odd mix, but somehow it works. You got relatively few of them have politics directly. And politics, as many people will know, is a notoriously hard thing to deal with successfully in fiction, especially if you've got a strong point of view. But in the story about a good confession, called A Good Confession, you have a woman called Mrs. McCarthy, and she's in saying her prayers in the chapel, and she Mass goes on, and then the priest gets up in the pulpit and makes a sermon, and he's a young curate, and he's telling the people they have to make a decision between politics and religion, because there's evil and there's good, and we have to follow the church's teaching if we're just going to consider ourselves Catholics. And Mrs. McCarthy's upset by this because she doesn't agree with it, and she intimates as much to the young priest, and the young priest, after the Mass, she says something to him, and the young priest sort of condescending towards her and sends her on her way. And she's upset that night, and she's thinking, what should I do? Should I go back to him? And you have him go back have her go back and meet the parish priest, who's been there for a lot longer and has a bit more sense and has a human way with her. I just thought that worked extremely well. It was clearly dealing with a political issue, and yet it was integrated into the story completely. And I thought, as I say, I thought it worked very well. Were you happy with that story yourself? Does it come to mind?
Yeah, there's an interesting sort of sequel to it. Steve MacDonagh wanted an advertisement on RTE publicising that book, and he had me do a sort of a 12-second clip, which was saying something like, "My name is Gerry Adams. I've just published a book called The Street. It's in good bookshops everywhere." So RTE wouldn't carry it, and Steve went to courts. And the entire book was read out in court. And Conor Cruise O'Brien, some of you may know of, was a notorious Shawneen, and he went to the court, and he cited that story as being the reason why the book could not be advertised in what he referred to as a national broadcaster, because that was so subversive, that this was challenging, and this woman was, So anybody of my age, I mean, the huge mistake that the church has made is not to acknowledge that women should be treated as equals, and not to acknowledge the role that women have played. And it's would be very unusual now for a woman to have 10 or 12 children, but it was very usual when I was growing up for women to have 8, 9, 10 and 12 children. And they reared them all. And they reared them according to the teachings of the church, and they were the backbone of the church. So here was this, as happened many times, this young curate telling this woman, woman with lived experience, woman with such wisdom, and so on. And, that was played out. I remember numerous times being at Mass, and the priest would say something, and somebody would stand up. I'm sure some of you might be here, and challenge him. And you'd have walkouts particularly after some incident of something happened, that people were stung by.
Would there have been many of the PPs as it's described in the story? Because and that's what I like particularly about it. You had the self-assured young curate laying down the law, and then Mrs. McCarthy runs into the PP, whom she's known for 10 years or something, and he's a much more human figure.
Well, that's the sort of a Father Des sort of, and we shouldn't, I'm not anti-clerical at all, but I'm trying to show both sides of it. I'm trying to show on the one side.
That's why it worked.
There's a man, a priest, who is wiser, and but also respects the woman, because he understands. And I'm recalling the story now. Like, she went to chapel very, very regularly, and she was a very, very, what we would call a very, very good Catholic. So that I think is a story that most people of my age coming from this part of the world would have some affinity with.
Mm-hmm. Well, as I say, it's unusual in my experience to find politics being integrated so well into a piece of fiction. I'd like to end, if that's well. Just before we end, do you find it you do find it easier? You say you prefer to write fiction rather than factual stuff. Do you find it easier to write fiction than factual stuff?
Provided you have the space. And yes, I much prefer it. I mean, I write political stuff probably every single day, and of course that's important. Don't get me wrong. But I said earlier that the writing is therapeutic. It's also a distraction. You can do it on your own. So if you live a very busy life as I do, and as you're normally surrounded by people, which is a blessing in many ways, but at times can be a bit invasive. So if you're able to get away on your own, and with a pen and paper, or in more recent times maybe with an iPad, you can lose yourself in that, and you can. I was saying to you earlier on about writing a story. This story will be called The Bus, and it's for publication in a book of short stories. Next year, a book of short stories that I signed up to do 5 years ago, and I haven't got it done. But that was sparked off by a bus driver friend of mine dying, and the priest at his mass, it was in the Donegal Gaeltacht, and he was speaking in Irish, but he said all human life was on that bus. And that's started me. And then before I had the thing written, I knew the end, and I knew the middle, and I knew the twist I was going to put onto it. And I thought that was, I was really pleased with myself. Now, when I say I knew the end, what I mean is I know how it would end. But I still haven't. I've tried to write the last sentence 27 times. I still haven't got the last sentence to the point that I'm. So all of that and the job of doing that, you just escape into it. And
Do you map them out in advance? Do you know with stories what way they're going to go, what the plot's going to be from beginning to end?
No. Sometimes
you do.
The plot? No, sometimes you do. I've also been writing a wee bit of poetry. So the odd time that will just come out in one lump. It'll just be in your head, and you'll sit down, and it'll come out. What standard it is an entirely different matter. But and sometimes you can just get a stream of consciousness and write the thing from beginning to end. The laptop or the iPad are wonderful tools. Because you could be moved by something and write 200 words and bank it, and in a year's time you can come and take that out, and it'll fit in somewhere, or you can use it. So I think that's really, and I take notes. Tom Hartley has been going through my notes. He used to do it without my permission, but he's been doing it now with my blessing. And you can write a note. Somebody will say something, or you'll pick up something, or you'll overhear. Maid Binchy used to say that she used to eavesdrop on people, just to pick up things that people would say. One of my favourite books, and I know we have to finish up, is a book called The Tailor and Anstey, which was translated, or at least was published by a man called Eric Corras. And the tailor and Anstey were an elderly couple, and they relate to me anyway to that sort of hidden Ireland, the Ireland that is tolerant and respectful and wants a bit of fun, and we're all now experts in hockey. I was listening to Dara O'Brien, who I think is a very, very clever person, and he lives in London, and he was talking about coming back home, and he says, you live in London? He says, I come home about 10 or 15 years ago, and we were all rich. And then a few years later, I come home, and we were all poor. And now when I come home this time, we're all gay. So there's that sort of... So the tailor and Anstey used to tell stories around the fire. It was a ceilidh house. And this guy published a book of their stories, and they were earthy stories, the type of stories that a certain age of a Belfast working class woman will engage in. And they always put men in their place. They're really brilliantly subversive sort of storytelling. Anyway, they were read out from the pulpit. Priests arrived down outside their house and burnt the book. So this couple who had just had this little ceilidh house then became a matter of huge notoriety. And all of our great writers were banned. All the women and men, all those famous internationally known writers were banned by the old patriarchy. So why did I tell you that? I told you that to say that I think that everybody has a story to tell, and those who can, who are literate, who have the ability to actually write, should find some way of telling their story. There's an audio project up here in the Falls Community Council where you can just go in and talk, and everybody should tell their story. And go back to my time at St Mary's. That's where I learned where the real stories are. So I would just actively encourage anybody that can't do that.
Okay, we're short on time. Before we go to that, just one very briefly answer me this. Do you polish your work? Do you draft it? Or do you write it and that's it?
No, I go back over the example I gave you there of not getting that last sentence.
Yeah.
I haven't got
but
that.
That'd be the norm. You would go over your work.
Yeah, well, not all of it. Some of it you would think it was okay.
Okay, okay. I'd like, if you wouldn't mind, ending with my favourite piece from Never Give Up, that section where a funny thing happens on the way to the hall. It's called Boxing Clever.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you all for turning out this evening, Gormag Gullier, and thank you, Jude, for being so nice to me. I'm not used to interviews. Yours being so nice to me. I'm actually editing, and it will be published before Christmas, hopefully, a cookbook. And it's called The Negotiator's Cookbook. So we hope that it'll be published by Sinn Féin, and we hope to have it out. And it's actually one of the best kept secrets of the Irish peace process, because what we used to do was, see, the Brits never fed us. Not only did they give us the great hunger, but when we were going for negotiations, they never had any food. So anyway, we, being intrepid Republicans, and being blessed by one or two great chefs, started to make our own food. So this is the recipes that sustained the Irish Republican negotiating team, and hopefully we'll have it out. And I'm hopeful that I'll get the book of short stories finished eventually, and it'll be published next year. This is true. This bit here on it. Actually, hopefully I'm not guilty of repeating the same story all the time, but some of it goes back to what you were saying earlier on. But this was triggered off by Michael Conlon. If you recall, he was robbed in a fight. Now, I'm not a big fan of boxing. I love Muhammad Ali and I love others, but there was a boxing competition in Long Kesh one time, and it's a very cruel sport. So I just don't like it. I think it's good to teach people self-defense, but I don't like it except at that very high level. But anyway, so I used to box way back, and a cousin of mine, Dominic Bagley, was a very good boxer. So I'll read this. It's
quite short. It's worth reading the whole thing.
All right. So, and this was the era of Freddie Gilroy, of Jim McCord, of Johnny Codwell. This is the period that we're talking about. Dominic Bagley was a relation of ours. He was a handy boxer. He was happy as well. So at the head of all the pugilistic excitement of the time, Dominic took me the short walk up Conway Street to the Shankill Road. I think the club was in the YMCA, but maybe not. I know it was close to the Eagle Supper Saloon. I didn't last very long, not more than a few months. I perfected the little hissing noise that boxers make when they're throwing or receiving punches. Liam, you might give us the hissing noise in case I get it wrong. I was brilliant at that. I was really good. And I was very good on the punch bag. The bit I never embraced when I was put into the ring was some other wee buck who seemed to have a homicidal desire to knock my head in. I never quite conquered the ability to not let my opponents hit me. My instinct was to talk to them. However, that seemed to compel them to hit me even harder and more often. Poor Dominic Bagley was distracted. So was I. Time and time again, he would stop the fight. Jared, he would entreat me, hit him back. Stop talking to him. He's only 7. You're 9. Don't keep backing away. Hit him with a left, then a right, and then the left again. And stop making that stupid hissing noise. So I did my best. My left-right, left combination became more polished and accomplished, so long as the punch bag didn't strike back. Dominic persevered. He used to spar with me when no one else would. Eventually he gave up and returned me to my granny. I'm sorry, Aunt Maggie, but now that he's wearing glasses, I don't think that boxing will suit him. I was glad, and Dominic was kind, and my granny seemed to be glad also. Well, at least no one will be able to pick on him, she said, thinking I was now an expert boxer. Little did I know how true that was. Actually, as it turned out, no one would be able to pick on my older brother, Paddy. Not when Paddy would say, do that again and I'll get our Gerry for you. I remember the day that it started. A big boy from across our street hit him one day when we were playing a game of rounders. Our Paddy was small for his age and he started crying. I challenged his assailant. He told me to mouth the way off. Before either of us knew, I hit him. Not just once, no. All my months of sparring with Dominic Bagley paid off. I hit the bigger lad with a left, then a right, and as his knees buckled and his nose spouted blood, I finished him off with another left. He was amazed. So was I. And I never hissed once. My next street fight was also our Paddy's fault. One of the Duns stole his kitten, I was sent out to get it back. Again, my winning combination had the desired effect. The catnapper collapsed on the Glen Road as I caught him with a left, then a right, and then another left. Then I made a mistake. I picked up the kitten, turned my back, and started to walk back to where our Paddy waited for his pet. That's when I got hit on the back of the head with a half brick from one of the Duns. An hour-down uppercut. Later, when I got out of the hospital, I was distraught to find that our Paddy gave his kitten away. For 14 Marleys, a Keely sucker, 2 gobstoppers, he did a Judas on me and handed the kitten back over to the brick thrower. Sinne, Gurmagov.
On your behalf, could I thank Gerry Adams, writer, revolutionary, political leader, ex-sponsor. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jude.